Right then, Apache Tomcat 7. What I wanted to talk about were mainly the changes that are in Tomcat 7 over and above Tomcat 6. So I'll discuss the specification changes briefly, look at some new features that are in Tomcat 7 that aren't covered by any of the specifications, talk about where Tomcat 7 is in terms of its current development, the future plans we have, and I'll wrap up with some useful resources and an opportunity to ask questions. So, who am I? I'm a committer on the Apache Tomcat project. I'm also a member of the Tomcat Project Management Committee. I wrote a large proportion of the updates for Tomcat 7, and I'm currently the Tomcat 7 release manager. Outside of Tomcat, I do some other bits and pieces at the ASF. I'm involved in Apache Commons. That's mainly DBCP and Pool because Tomcat uses both of those. I'm also a member of the ASF, and I help out with both the infrastructure teams and the security team. At VMware, I lead Spring Source's security team, and I'm also one of the TC server developers. So let's start off with the specification changes. And we'll cover each of the three specifications in turn. That's Servlet 3, JSP 2.2, and Expression Language 2.2. First of all then, Servlet 3. Servlet 3 requires the use of Java 1.6. There's no particular technical reason for this. It's more to do with the fact that Java 1.5 had already reached end of life by the time that the Servlet 3 specification was produced. From memory, there's probably about 20 places in the Tomcat codebase where it actually uses a Java 1.6 feature, and it would be really easy to work around those if we wanted to, but Servlet 3 requires Java 1.6, so that's what we use. Big change in Servlet 3 is the ability to do asynchronous processing. Here what you can do is, rather than the traditional processing model, as you'll see in earlier Servlet specification versions, where a thread is dedicated to a request and response pair from the moment the request is received all the way through until the final byte of the response is written. If there's a big pause somewhere in the middle, you need to go and query a database or do some offline processing or go and do anything that might take a fair amount of time where the thread's just going to sit there. Prior to Servlet 3, the thread just had to sit there. What Servlet 3 lets you do is the request processing can reach a particular point where you know that you're going to be doing a long-running process elsewhere, some sort of long-running external request. I mean, databases are the typical example, but it could also be a web service call or something similar. And what you can do is you can put the request and response pair into asynchronous mode. That releases the container thread to go and handle another user request, and then when the response is received from whatever third party that you sent your query off to, then you can restart that request and response pair, probably on another thread, and then they will go through to completion. So it lets you have more efficient use of your container threads because you don't have to leave the container threads hanging around twiddling their thumbs whilst some external request or some long-running request, you're waiting for that to come back. The pluggability is another big part of Servlet 3, and this has both positives and negatives. There are a couple of aspects to pluggability. The first is something called web fragments. It lets any jar file contain a web XML fragment that you can then use to configure part of your web application. So it can define servlets, it can define filters, it can define security rules, and anything that you can put in a web XML file can go in a web fragment. The second part of this is annotations. Annotations can be on any class in a jar and mark the class as a servlet or as a filter. It means you don't need to write any web.xml in order to configure that particular servlet or filter or listener or any of the other things that you're allowed to configure via annotations. The problem, particularly with annotations and less so with pluggability, is that as a system administrator, you have absolutely no idea what the container's done. You don't know what annotations it might have found, you don't know what web fragments might have been found, you don't know how they've been merged into the main web.xml unless you check all of the jars for fragments and you are very conversant with the rules for merging them. For example, something that you could have an unexpected effect of, you've got a jar file that's got a particular library in it that you want to use. You don't realise that there's also some annotated servlets in that jar file. You drop the jar file into your web application, and without you knowing it, those servlets are then mapped to particular URLs. And that could present both functionality and security problems. So, and there are ways around this. What Tomcat 7 does is it gives you the ability to log the effective web.xml after Tomcat has done all the merging. Then you can take that merged web.xml and then use that in your web application and tell Tomcat not to scan any more annotations, not to scan any fragments, just use this one single merged version. And that will solve both the security problem and the admin not really knowing what's going on problem. In terms of session management, users have been given a few more options. Session management via tracking the SSL session ID is now available, although if you select that option, none of the other session tracking options are available. So you can only use SSL session ID tracking on its own. The other options remain URL rewriting and cookies, but you have the option of accepting one, both, or neither of those. So you have a little bit more control over what's going on. HTTP only is now part of the spec. That's the flag that marks cookies only to be used in HTTP requests, not to be made available for scripts. We've talked about that before, and that's something that helps prevent cross-site scripting. There's also the ability for programmatic login. This lets you take a username and password and programmatically log the user in. Where that might be useful is, say you've got an account creation screen in your application, the user's just supplied their username and password. Rather than requiring the user to then go and log themselves in with that username and password, you can take the username and password and log them in programmatically. The changes in JSP 2.2 then, not really very much here. There's a few more attributes that you can configure in JSP property groups. Those are the groups that you can define in web.xml that give a particular set of properties to a particular set of JSPs. And there's a new emit attribute for the JSP attribute tag, which lets you use things like expression language to determine whether or not the tag is omitted or not. And finally, in expression language, there's a little bit of tidying up around the edges, but really the big thing there is method invocations. You can now call methods on beans, whereas before you could only access getters and setters. There are ways that you could fudge that and sort of hack in calling methods, but now you have got genuine method invocation. So let's look at some of the new features in Tomcat 7 then, and all of these aren't sort of part of the spec, they're Tomcat specific. First of all, there's the JMX Remote Lifecycle Listener. What that lets you do is when you want to manage Tomcat via JMX, it's all well and good when you're doing it on your local development machine, but in production there tends to be firewalls all over the place, and the JMX protocol effectively will, by default, will pick 2 ports at random to use to communicate, and that makes it really difficult to open those ports to a firewall because every time you connect they're going to be different. The Remote Lifecycle Listener allows you to fix both of those ports, so you can then open up just those ports in the firewall. Those ports will always be used, and that way you can use JConsole or any other JMX-based tool to connect to your Tomcat instance. The Manager application has been enhanced, so it can now tell the difference between a primary, backup, and proxy session. I guess that begs the question, what is the difference between a primary, backup, and proxy session? Well, they occur when clustering is being used. And a primary session is the session on the node the user is interacting with. So that's effectively the current copy, as it were. A backup session is a copy of that session that is held on another node, but the user isn't interacting with it. So there'll normally be a primary session and one or more backup sessions, depending on which clustering configuration you're using. And finally, proxy sessions, they're used when you use the backup manager, and proxy sessions don't contain any of the session data. All they contain are the location of the primary session and the location of the backup session. So if you fail over onto a node that contains a proxy session, it knows where to go to retrieve a copy of your data, so it can re-establish the session on that node, make it the primary session, and then carry on. We've done some work to align the MBeans with reality. I say we, this was primarily a Google Summer of Code project back in the summer of 2010. The work there was to address the problem whereby the MBean definitions had diverged somewhat from the code base. So a lot of work was done to realign the MBeans with the code base, so only properties that exist are exposed via the MBeans, and all of the properties that exist are exposed via the MBeans. There was also some work, but not as much as I hoped, towards exposing more methods and more MBeans, but we did get as far as being able to start Tomcat with a server XML file that contains just a server element and absolutely nothing else, and then just via JMX create the engine, create the connectors, create the service, create the hosts, create the web applications. And that does open up the possibility of being able to use JMX for dynamic provisioning. Okay, in terms of performance, there's no really big performance improvement in Tomcat 7, but there are a couple of incremental improvements. One's particularly worth mentioning. You can limit the number of loaded JSPs with a least recently used cache, and what that will do is if you've got a application that has lots and lots and lots of JSPs, then it can tend to be a bit of a memory hog, which is usually less of an issue in production and more of an issue in development. The limiting the number of loaded JSPs just allows you to keep the memory usage under control. That was contributed by a user, as was the next feature, which is the ability to flush gzip compressed output streams. So that allows for better performance and faster responses to users when you're using gzipped output. We did find out about a bottleneck in session ID generation. It was somewhat accidental that we found out about it. I was at Java 1 last year and going to all sorts of presentations about performance tuning, optimization, garbage collection, and the like. And one of them happened to be talking about web applications, and they sort of said along the way, oh, and by the way, there's a bottleneck on session ID generation in Tomcat. My first response was, well, thanks very much for telling us. You know, you've known about this for a while. It would have been nice if you'd let us know, but hey-ho. I've got the details, and that's now been fixed. The crawler session management valve, that's something that came out of my work with the Apache infrastructure team hosting Jira. Jira always at the ASF always runs on the latest release of Tomcat 7. And we were noticing that there were lots and lots of sessions being created by crawlers such as Googlebot and Yahoo's bot and the like. The crawler session management valve just provides a way of managing those so you don't get so many sessions. And the last time I checked, Jira at the ASF was running at around 1,500 concurrent sessions. It had been up as high as 100,000, so it's made a real difference. Next up is an NIO implementation of the AJP protocol. That's available in Tomcat 7.0.15 onwards, and that brings the benefits of non-blocking I/O to the AJP protocol without having to use the APR native connector, which was previously the only other way of doing that. Moving on then to look at web application resources. So these are the things that normally get configured in a context element, and they're normally databases. The vast majority of resources that I see configured are data sources to connect to databases, and there's a couple of new attributes that we've made available. First of all is the singleton attribute. Now, if you read the servlet specification and the Java EE specification correctly, then what it says is that every time you retrieve a resource from Jindy, you should always get a new resource. And at first pass, that seems to make sense. Then you start thinking about it, hang on a minute, if I've got a data source and I'm using database connection pooling, I don't want to retrieve an entire new database connection pool every time I look up the pool in Jindy. And Tomcat doesn't do that. Tomcat will always give you the same pool. In fact, by default, Tomcat will do that for every resource, and that's not strictly specification compliant. Well, it's no strictly about it. It's not specification compliant, but it is what users expect. So to work around that little problem, Tomcat has provided the singleton attribute that you can now set on a resource, and if that's set to true, every time you retrieve the resource from Jindy, you will always get a new instance of the resource. If it's set to false, then you'll get a cached copy of the resource. We've also added a close method attribute. There is no API provided within Jindy or J2EE or anything else to close down these resources when they're no longer required. And if you have per web application resources, then it's often useful to be able to close down those resources when the web application closed down. So the close method attribute allows you to specify a no argument method that Tomcat will call on that resource to shut it down. And that's used with the built-in connection pool in Tomcat, and that does help clean up resources when web applications shut down. Moving on to deployment then, probably the biggest change is the support for parallel deployment. That's the ability to have multiple versions of the same web application deployed in parallel. New requests will always go to the latest version of the application, but a request that started off using, say, version 1 will continue using version 1 of the application even if version 2, 3, 4 or whatever is deployed alongside it. It provides a way to do rolling upgrades so that existing users carry on using version 1, new users get to use version 2, and once all of the sessions have expired for version 1, then you can just undeploy that version of the application. So over the years, there's been quite a bit of confusion about how Tomcat handles context.xml files, what gets copied into Catalina base engine host, and what doesn't. Sorry, that should be Catalina base conf engine host, then context name.xml. When it gets copied, when it doesn't, and things have changed between different versions, and there has been another change in Tomcat 7, but what this should do is hopefully make it a little bit simpler, but retaining enough configuration options that it's always possible to configure it how Tomcat 6 works. So now, by default, Tomcat 7 will not extract a context.xml file from a WAR file. It will just read it in place. If you want to extract it, then that's configurable on the host element. We've added support for aliases. Aliases let you specify external content and include it within a web application. So, for example, you could add an alias for an images directory or a JavaScript directory, point that to some external location that all of your web applications reference, and then it's made available under whatever URL path you wish within your web application. The memory leak detection and prevention that's already in Tomcat 6, we've added some improvements for Tomcat 7, just trying to do a better, safer job of cleaning things up like thread locals. They're actually pretty difficult things for Tomcat to clean up. It's much better if the web application cleans them up itself, but if it doesn't, then Tomcat 7 is a little bit better at cleaning those up and cleaning them up safely. In terms of security, we've added the cross-site request forgery, excuse me, the cross-site request forgery protection filter. That's available for any web application to use. It's also used by default for the manager and the host manager application. Alongside that, some of the role names and URLs within the manager application have changed. If you do upgrade from Tomcat 6 to Tomcat 7 and don't connect to the right URL, you should get an error message that explains what's changed. Essentially, anything that you used to access via /manager, you now have to access via /manager/text. We've enabled the lockout realm by default, so if you have more than 5 failed login attempts, then the user will be locked out. I think it's for 10 minutes by default. That's set in server.xml and that's all configurable. We've also enabled an access log by default. Other security improvements, for those of you that are still using server-side includes, probably not very many, but those of you that are, the exec method is disabled by default now. Again, that can be re-enabled via configuration. And as a result of numerous cases of people misusing and abusing the default servlet and remapping it to a different URL path and exposing various security issues, it will now always serve content from the root of the context by default, regardless of what URL path it is mapped to. We've improved the handling of what happens if a user bookmarks the login page. Because that requires a session and Tomcat has to keep a record of the previous request in the session. If the session expires then, or isn't available for some other reason, then you would see a strange error message. That's now been improved. Session IDs, they're generated using secure random by default. That can cause some startup delay in Tomcat 7 compared to Tomcat 6. You can configure that using non-secure random sources if you wish. In production, I'd recommend you just suffer the startup delay. It's a one-time thing on startup and then it will be fine. The JVM has finally caught up with the SSL renegotiation bugs. Tomcat now handles JVMs that do support secure renegotiation and JVMs that don't. It will enable it by default if the JVM supports it securely, and it will disable it by default if the JVM doesn't. However, you can re-enable it in that case with obviously the appropriate security caveats. We've also added SSL renegotiation to the HTTP IO connector because that particular feature wasn't available. It is now. We've added a security listener. This is primarily for Linux, and it's there to check that Tomcat starts up as an appropriate user and as an appropriate UMask, and if it doesn't, then Tomcat will just refuse to start. Really, that's there as a safety measure to stop you accidentally starting Tomcat as root. We've improved the access logging of failed requests. Access logging is configured as a valve, which previously meant that if the request didn't get as far as the first valve before it failed, then it would never get logged. Now, even if the request doesn't make it as far as the first valve, then we will still log it. Next in security, cookie pass, and I can't remember whether it's IE or Firefox that doesn't quite handle this the way you'd expect, but to ensure that if you have a session cookie for a context named foo, that you don't also send that session cookie if you're accessing a context called foobar, then Tomcat will now add slashes to the end of the cookie paths. Next up, embedding and extending. We've hopefully made it easier to both embed and extend Tomcat. The biggest change here is the new org Apache Catalina Startup Tomcat class, and that's aimed primarily at embedding. It's meant to make it much easier to embed Tomcat. There's also a set of embedded jars, which rather than having lots of separate jars, has a much smaller number of jars, and with each of the key features you can use for having Tomcat in embedded environments. So there's a core jar, there's 2 logging jars depending on which logging implementation you need. Jasper is a separate jar as well. So if you don't need JSPs, then you don't need to bother with Jasper. So you can pick the jars you want, but it's a much smaller number, and then it's just a single class, and there's lots and lots of examples of how to embed Tomcat in the unit tests. Pretty much all of the unit tests are based around embedded Tomcat now. We've improved the way that things like TLDs are scanned, and there's a new interface both for accessing TLDs called the jar resource, and there's also a new interface for actually controlling the scanning of the jars, so you can implement your own customized jar scanning if you so wish. In addition to that, we also provide binary and source jars now for building via Apache Maven. There's also been quite a bit of code cleanup. Some of this cleanup does mean that things that work with Tomcat 6 will not work with Tomcat 7. Some methods have been made final, some classes have moved package, some things just don't exist anymore at all. So if you've got custom code that's built on Tomcat 6 internals, just do some checks to make sure it will actually build with Tomcat 7. So what does that cleanup consist of? We've used generics throughout. There's a much better definition of the lifecycle interface, and all of the components that use it have been cleaned up to follow that interface. The comic classes actually had a move package. That was so we could make comic accessible when running under a security manager. If they weren't in a separate package, then we would have had to have opened up too much to an untrusted web application. Significantly expanded the unit tests. Tomcat 7 has a whole lot more of these, and we're adding to them all the time. Generally, when we fix a bug now, we also include a unit test that checks that the bug has been fixed and continues to be fixed. We've added check style and find bugs to the build process. There are quite a few false positives generated, particularly by find bugs. So if you do build Tomcat from source and you're running those, particularly say in an IDE, do make sure you're picking up the right configurations to exclude the stuff that we know are false positives. A lot of unused, deprecated and duplicated code has been removed. That to some extent is an ongoing task. At this point in Tomcat 7 lifecycle, I think we'll probably do the bits that don't involve obvious changes to Tomcat's external API. We might tweak a few things internally, but I think the big changes there have all been done for now. There'll probably be another round of that come Tomcat 8, where we might make some more significant changes to the APIs. So as I said, if you've got some custom components using Tomcat internals, then you're likely to need to change them. The support for Windows is a whole lot better. The Windows installer has been significantly improved, as well as correctly detecting whether or not a 32 or a 64-bit JVM is being used. It will also now allow configuration of the HTTP, well, in fact, all of the ports, HTTP, AJP, and the shutdown port. In addition, you can specify the service name, and the Windows installer will also now let you install multiple instances of Tomcat alongside each other. Other features for Windows, probably native authentication support is the other big one. That will let you integrate Tomcat security with Windows domain security, so users can use their Windows domain usernames and passwords in order to log on. And if they're logging on from a workstation that's part of the domain, that should be completely seamless. They wouldn't even need to enter a username and password. So where are we with the current developments? Tomcat 7 was stable as of 7.06. The current release is actually 7.019. That went out last week. And we're aiming to provide a release every month. We usually start the release process around the 1st of the month, and depending on how smoothly things go, the release will happen 1 to 3 weeks later. If it all goes nice and smoothly, it'll be a week later. If we identify any regressions that mean we need to re-roll the release, then that date will obviously slip. But the starting point is, say, a release a month, and I always start that process on the first of the month. Every single Tomcat 7 release has passed all of the TCKs, and it's passed them in just about every combination of connector and an HTTP D module that Tomcats typically use, which that you can imagine. So we've got pretty good testing coverage with those, but obviously the testing they provide isn't complete. So as of today, which is the 26th of July, there's one open Tomcat 7 bug, and I've just written a whole bunch of unit tests for that bug before I get around to writing the fix. All of the other open bugs in Tomcat 5 and 6 have all been fixed and all have patches provided. Not all of those patches have been applied, but they have all got patches provided. There's also somewhere around 115, 120 enhancements requests, and some of those have been open for a few days, some of them have been open for a number of years, and the priority that we're tackling those really is a mixture of what the developers are interested in, whether or not a patch has been provided, and what the users are indicating that they're interested in. If there is a particular enhancement request that you'd like to see in Tomcat, then I do encourage you to vote for it in Bugzilla, because now we've got to the point where pretty much it's just the enhancement requests that are left. Then we are using the number of votes in Bugzilla as an indication of how many users are actually interested in. It's not the only criteria that's being used by committers to determine which enhancement gets implemented next, but it is one that, as I say, is taken into account. In terms of future plans, work is ongoing on a new version of Commons DBCP, and one that will work much better in multiprocessor environments, and it should get the performance alongside that of the JDBC pool that Philip, one of my Spring Source colleagues, wrote, and it's now available in Tomcat 7 as an option. There's work on Socket I/O, and that includes WebSockets. I've got the basics of a very simple Socket I/O implementation sat on my local machine at the minute. It's not really at the point where I'd be happy to commit it, and it's only implementing one of the really easy protocols. We haven't implemented WebSockets yet, but once I've tidied that up, that will get committed, and then people will obviously be in a position to review it, comment on it, add their own enhancements and the like. We will continue to keep on top of the open bugs. We've been doing a pretty good job of that since the first stable Tomcat 7 release. As I say, at the minute, it's just the one open bug in Tomcat 7 that hasn't got a patch, and that was only open this morning. And as I said previously, we will continue to review all the open enhancement requests. I'll wrap up with some useful resources. Obviously, the Tomcat website. We also have a blog where we do occasionally talk about interesting new features. The mailing lists continue to be the most active areas, particularly the users list, but we also have a dev list and the announce list. Difference between those two lists, really, if it's a question about using Tomcat, it belongs on the users list. If it involves changing the Tomcat source code, it belongs on the dev list. If you're not sure, ask on the users list, and then we'll always redirect you if necessary. The community tends to be far more tolerant of people asking dev questions on the users list than they are of asking users questions on the dev list. Finally, if you want a low volume mailing list just to keep track of what's going on, then I recommend the announce list. That will only get emails for releases and security vulnerabilities, so it probably averages about one email every 2 weeks. If you want to search the archives, then my personal recommendation is tomcat.markmail.org. That's a really nice interface for searching the archives. It's the one that I always use when I need to go and look for something. You can always get the latest changelog in SVN, and if you view it at svn.apache.org /repos/asf/tomcat/trunk/webapps/docs/changelog.xml, then that will give you a nice, pretty printed, pretty formatted version of the changelog, and you can see what changes have gone in to Tomcat trunk since the last release. You can always get the latest version of the Tomcat documentation from the CI server. The version on the website will always be the documentation for the latest release. If you want the absolute up-to-the-minute documentation that has got all of the changes from trunk, then you need to look at the CI server, and that's ci.apache.org. And if you want to keep track of the Open Tomcat 7 issues, then s.apache.org/tomcat-7-open-issues. That's a shortened URL that will take you to Bugzilla and a list of all of the current Open Tomcat 7 bugs. And there, I think we will finish off.